I never thought I'd be standing in a backyard in Sydney, staring at something that would change everything I thought I knew about human nature. But mate, what happened on Byron Street that October morning in 1892 still gives me chills, and I've been living in this neighborhood for over 20 years. You see, I grew up hearing whispers about the house at number 25, but nobody ever talked about what really went down there. Nobody wanted to remember. If you've ever felt like your neighborhood was hiding something dark, drop "buried" in the comments, because what James Mahoney uncovered that day wasn't just bodies. It was the most disturbing criminal enterprise Australia had ever seen. The warm October sun was beating down mercilessly as James Mahoney wiped the sweat from his brow, the kind of heat that makes your shirt stick to your back like a second skin. He was working alongside Frank Cooney in the backyard of 25, Byron Street, right here in this Sydney suburb where I'm standing now. The air was thick with that distinctive smell of eucalyptus and red dirt that you only get in Australia, mixed with the acrid stench of the sewer work they were doing. Their job was simple enough: dig a trench to connect a service pipe to the main sewer line. Back-breaking work that had both men drenched in sweat and covered in mud. But when Mahoney's shovel hit something that wasn't dirt, something that made a sound he'd never heard before, everything changed. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than a bundle of old rags, maybe some rubbish left behind by previous tenants. You know how it is when you move into a new place and find all sorts of random stuff buried in the garden. But as Mahoney bent down, brushing away the red Sydney soil with calloused hands, he saw something that made his blood run cold. It was flesh. Decomposing, unmistakable human flesh. And as he looked closer, his stomach dropped to his boots. It was the small, fragile remains of an infant, buried just 6 inches below the surface like a discarded toy. The two men stood there in stunned silence, the October heat suddenly feeling like ice on their skin. Frank's face had gone white as a sheet, and Mahoney felt his hands trembling as they hastily reburied the tiny body. Neither man spoke. What do you say when you've just uncovered something so horrific? They both thought, hoped, that maybe it was some sort of tragic accident, some family secret that had been buried and forgotten. Maybe the baby had died naturally, and the family, in their grief, had simply buried it in the backyard. These things happened, right? But deep down, something told them this was different. This was wrong. The next morning they returned to the site, hoping that in the harsh light of the Australian sun, what they'd found the day before would somehow seem less real. But instead of relief, they found only more horror. Just 30 yards from where they'd made their first grisly discovery, their shovels struck something else. This time, it was the body of a female infant, and unlike the first find, there was no mistaking the deliberate nature of this burial. Someone had placed these children here with intention. Someone had killed them, and that someone might still be out there. When Senior Constable James Joyce arrived at the scene, his weathered face betrayed none of the shock he must have felt. He'd seen his share of crime in Sydney's rough neighborhoods, but this was different. The forensic examiner would later determine that the female infant had been buried for 6 weeks, the male for closer to 3 months. The current tenants had only moved in 3 weeks prior, which meant one terrifying thing. Whoever had buried these babies was the previous occupant of the house, and they were out there somewhere, possibly continuing their horrific work. The investigation led police straight to John and Sarah Makin, a couple who had lived at 25, Byron Street before mysteriously relocating to Wells Street in Redfern. On the surface, they seemed like any other struggling family trying to make ends meet in late 19th century Australia. John, born in 1845 in Dapto, was the fourth of 11 children in a family that knew poverty intimately. Sarah, also born in 1845 in Sydney, was the daughter of a former convict who had turned his life around to become a miller. Her first marriage had ended in divorce, almost unheard of in that era, but she'd found what seemed like stability when she married John in 1871. But stability was the last thing the Makin household knew. John bounced from job to job like a pinball, never able to hold steady employment. He drove carts, hauled goods, made deliveries, but his reputation for laziness followed him like a shadow. In 1881, he was convicted of theft and spent 3 months behind bars. Then in 1885, while working as a delivery driver, his horse-drawn carriage struck a 4-year-old boy on Elizabeth Street, leaving the child fighting for his life with a severe concussion. The incident seemed to shake something loose in John's already fragile work ethic. By 1892, John had stopped working altogether. Neighbors described seeing him sitting in front of their house on Levy Street in Chippendale, day after day, while his wife and daughters scrambled to keep the family afloat. Despite their obvious poverty, they moved constantly, never settling anywhere for long. John loved to boast about his supposed wealth, telling anyone who'd listen that he was receiving £1 a week from property he'd inherited after his mother's death in 1890. But whatever money he claimed to have, it was never enough. The Makin household remained desperately poor. It was during this time of crushing financial hardship that John and Sarah discovered a dark new source of income that would make their names synonymous with evil. By the late 19th century, something called baby farming had become a disturbing reality in Sydney. You'd see advertisements in newspapers, promises of adoptions with no questions asked. Desperate mothers, often unwed and burdened by the crushing social stigma of the time, sought out women willing to take their infants in exchange for a fee. For anywhere between £3 and £5, a significant sum for working-class families, a woman could supposedly rid herself of an unwanted pregnancy, trusting that her child would be raised in a safe, loving home. But for too many of these innocent babies, that promised future never came. Sydney was battling a silent epidemic of syphilis that affected rich and poor alike, but it carried an especially cruel fate for newborns. Many infants were born already infected, and these sick babies were often given away for mere pennies, their fates sealed the moment they left their mother's arms. For baby farmers like John and Sarah, these children represented nothing more than profit margins. The less money spent on their care, the greater the return on investment. Sarah was perfectly positioned for this grisly trade. As a trained midwife, she could offer the kind of professional reassurance these desperate women craved, while John played the role of the stable, trustworthy provider. They promised every mother the same thing, that their child would be cared for, loved, and raised as one of their own. But the reality was far more sinister. The babies they collected simply disappeared, whether through deliberate neglect, starvation, or something even more horrific. But what I discovered next will leave you speechless. The Makins had perfected their system of horror through years of practice. They moved frequently, always staying one step ahead of suspicion, discarding their tiny victims before slipping away to another rented home where they could start the cycle all over again. By October 1892, when those first bodies were discovered, they had already relocated to Wells Street in Redfern, just another step in their carefully choreographed dance of death. Take the case of 19-year-old Agnes Ward, whose story still breaks my heart when I think about it. In April 1892, she placed an advertisement in the evening news, desperately seeking a kind lady to adopt her baby boy. John and Sarah answered that call like vultures circling prey. They met Agnes at a midwife's home where she had given birth to her son Charles just 2 months earlier. John, ever the practiced liar, spun her a heartbreaking tale about how they had recently lost their own child, little Johnny, and how her boy could fill that empty space in their hearts. The price for this supposed salvation was just £5. They promised Agnes they lived on Kettle Street in Redfern but would be moving to a farm soon, painting pictures of wide open spaces and fresh air for her boy. She believed every word as she watched Sarah bundle up little Charles and carry him away, her heart breaking but believing she was giving him a better life than she could provide. John even promised to send their new address so she could visit. But Agnes never saw her son again. Months later, when police were digging through the Makins' former properties, Charles's body was found buried at 109 George Street in Redfern, marked only with a crude C carved into a piece of wood. The pattern repeated with sickening regularity. Clara Risby responded to their advertisement in May 1892, offering £5 for the adoption of her infant daughter. The Makins, now using the false name McLaughlin, invited her to a house on East Street in Redfern. Sarah greeted Clara warmly, her motherly demeanour hiding the cold calculation beneath. John spun another elaborate lie about inheriting money and planning to open a poultry farm in Rockdale, even promising to stay in touch with updates on the child's well-being. But when Clara returned 2 days later to check on her baby, Sarah claimed to be out with the child. When she came back again, the house was completely empty, as if the Makins had simply vanished into thin air. 18-year-old Amber Murray's story followed the same horrific pattern. In June 1892, she placed an advertisement seeking a motherly person to adopt her newborn son Horace. The Makins responded, this time signing their letter under the name E. Hill. They met with Amber, inspected baby Horace like they were examining livestock, and declared him exactly what they were looking for. They painted the same picture of love and proper upbringing, and Amber, believing she was doing the right thing for her son, handed over £3 along with all the adoption paperwork. Within days, the Makins had vanished again, taking little Horace to what would become his grave. 4 months, possibly years, no one suspected the true scope of their operation. The Makins were ghosts, moving from house to house, leaving behind only shallow graves and broken promises. To anyone who bothered to notice, they were just another struggling family trying to survive in a harsh world. But in reality, every home they occupied became another cemetery, every move another chance to cover their tracks. The authorities had no reason to investigate, not yet, anyway. Baby farming operated in the shadows of society, preying on women who had no voice, no power, no one to advocate for them or their children. It was a perfect crime, invisible and seemingly victimless, because who would report a missing baby that was supposed to disappear anyway? But everything changed on that October afternoon when James Mahoney's shovel struck something it shouldn't have. Even after finding those first 2 bodies, police had no idea they were dealing with serial killers operating on an unprecedented scale. It was only when another body was discovered a few days later on Zamia Street in Redfern that Senior Constable Joyce began to see a pattern. When he searched the backyard of 6 Wells Street, where the Makins had most recently lived, he noticed recently disturbed earth. But when he dug into it, the hole was empty, as if someone had been there before him, hastily relocating evidence. This discovery sent chills down Joyce's spine because it meant one terrifying thing. Whoever was responsible was still out there, still active, still dangerous. They were organized enough to move bodies, calculating enough to stay ahead of the investigation. The first 2 bodies were examined and determined to be a male child between 5 and 8 months old, and a female infant. Although their identities remained unknown, one fact was undeniable. They had been buried while John and Sarah Makin were living at 25 Barron Street. By late October 1892, the case had reached the city coroner, who convened a jury to hear testimony from the workmen who found the bodies, the doctors who performed the autopsies, and neighbors who had lived next to the Makins. When John and Sarah took the stand, they were calm and prepared, their stories rehearsed to perfection. Sarah claimed that after moving to MacDonaldtown in late June, she had taken in just one child, a female infant about 2 weeks old, to wet nurse for payment of 10 shillings a week. She insisted the mother had taken the child back, claiming she was moving to Melbourne. John nodded along, backing every word with the confidence of a practiced liar. But the jury returned with an open verdict, meaning there wasn't enough evidence to determine guilt. John and Sarah seemed to have escaped justice, walking free while the bodies of their victims lay in unmarked graves. But Senior Constable Joyce wasn't finished. He began a systematic investigation of every property the Makins had ever occupied, turning their past into an archaeological dig of horror. On November 2, 1892, police returned to 25 Byron Street with shovels and a grim determination to uncover the truth. What they found defied imagination. 5 more infant bodies buried in the backyard like a grotesque garden of the dead. 7 bodies in one location. This wasn't accidental death or unfortunate circumstance. This was systematic murder on a scale that shocked even hardened police officers. The discovery sent shockwaves through Sydney society. Newspapers seized on the story with headlines that screamed of unthinkable horror, while in the streets there was a mixture of disbelief and outrage that such monsters could walk among them, masquerading as caring adoptive parents while turning infant graves into profit margins. The public had been vaguely aware that baby farming existed, but never on this scale, never with such cold, calculating brutality. On November 3rd, John and Sarah were arrested separately, along with their oldest daughters, Blanche and Florence, who were detained for questioning. Under pressure, Blanche cracked, admitting that her parents had coached her to lie at the inquest, instructing her to deny that there had been multiple infants in their care. The carefully constructed facade was crumbling, revealing the true scope of their operation. As the investigation expanded beyond Byron Street, police began excavating yards in Botany, East Street, Kettle Street, and St. Peter's, all former Makin residences. With each dig, another horrifying truth was unearthed. By November 12th, authorities had discovered a total of 15 bodies scattered across the various homes where the Makins had lived. 15 innocent babies, murdered for profit and buried like garbage. Although the decomposition made individual identification nearly impossible, one case stood out: the murder of little Horace Murray. His mother Amber had handed him over in good faith, believing he would be raised in a loving home. Instead, his remains were among those recovered, but they were sufficiently preserved for authorities to make positive identification. Finally, they had a case they could prosecute. On November 28th, John and Sarah were formally charged with Horace's murder. What had started as a routine sewer connection job had become one of the most notorious crimes in Australian history. By the time they stood trial in March 1893, their names had become synonymous with evil throughout the continent. But despite the overwhelming horror surrounding the case, the trial would hinge on one crucial question: could the prosecution actually prove murder? Since Amber Murray had personally handed Horace over to the Makins in exchange for payment, and his body had been found buried in one of their former residences, prosecutors believed this was their strongest case. But proving the actual cause of death remained a challenge that would determine whether justice would finally be served. The trial began on March 6, 1893, and from the moment John and Sarah entered the courtroom, their contrasting demeanours told a story of guilt and calculation. John sat with his arms crossed, cold and unbothered, his face an unreadable mask that betrayed nothing of the monster beneath. Sarah, however, kept her face buried in her handkerchief, whether from genuine remorse, calculated performance, or simple fear of the gallows that awaited her. Their defense attorney argued that no doctor had been able to prove that Horace or any of the other children had been murdered, suggesting they could have died from the diseases and malnutrition that claimed so many infants in that era. It was an argument that had worked for other baby farmers in the past, but the prosecution was relentless in building their case. When Amber Murray took the stand, her testimony was devastating in its simplicity and heartbreak. She recounted how she had entrusted her precious child to the Makins, believing they would give him the love and care she couldn't provide. When shown clothing found with the body marked H, she recognized them instantly, the same garments little Horace had been wearing the day she kissed him goodbye and handed him over to what she thought was safety. Senior Constable Joyce's testimony proved to be the most chilling of all. He described finding bloodstains on the clothing of the deceased, particularly beneath their tiny armpits. Based on this evidence, Joyce theorized that the Makins had used an instrument like a needle or hat pin, long enough to reach the heart, a method that left no visible injuries on the body while ensuring a quick, silent death. Although the theory couldn't be confirmed beyond doubt, the jury listened in stunned silence as Joyce painted a picture of cold, calculated murder designed to maximize profit while minimizing risk. With every witness, the prosecution chipped away at the Makins' facade, showing that their pattern of deception spanned years, multiple houses, and countless victims. Although the evidence was circumstantial, there was simply too much of it to ignore. The sheer volume of bodies, the systematic nature of the moves, the consistent pattern of taking money and making children disappear, it all pointed to one inescapable conclusion. By the end of the trial's third day, the prosecution rested their case. The defense declined to present witnesses, and John and Sarah chose not to take the stand in their own defense. Instead, their lawyer made one final attempt to cast doubt on the evidence, arguing there was no proof the deaths had been deliberate and that the jury was being asked to convict based on emotion rather than fact. On the evening of March 8th, the jury retired to deliberate the fate of two people who had turned the murder of infants into a business model. At 10 o'clock the following morning, they returned with their verdict: guilty. Both John and Sarah were convicted of the murder of little Horace Murray, but in a surprising twist that would determine their ultimate fates, the jury added a strong recommendation for mercy in Sarah's case, perhaps influenced by her tearful, fragile appearance throughout the trial. As the judge prepared to deliver their sentences, John and Sarah sat in silence, their futures hanging in the balance. The judge wasted no time in condemning their crimes, describing how they had preyed on desperate mothers, taking their money under false pretenses while sealing the fate of those they promised to care for. He reminded the court how callously they had buried their victims, treating them like refuse to be disposed of rather than human beings deserving of love and care. Then came the moment that would seal their fates. Both John and Sarah were sentenced to death by hanging. But following the jury's recommendation, the judge promised to forward a petition for clemency on Sarah's behalf. The moment these words left his lips, Sarah collapsed in hysterics, wailing repeatedly, "Oh, my babies!" For many witnesses, this display seemed hollow and calculated. She had buried 15 infants without apparent remorse, but now portrayed herself as the victim. Their lawyer immediately filed an appeal, arguing that the trial judge had improperly admitted evidence about the other bodies found at various properties. But on March 30th, the Supreme Court dismissed the appeal entirely, stating that while the defense had valid concerns, the sheer weight of circumstantial evidence made their guilt undeniable. With no hope left in Australia, the Makins turned to the highest court in the British Empire, the Privy Council in London. While this final appeal was being considered, the Executive Council commuted Sarah's sentence to life imprisonment, influenced by the jury's recommendation for mercy and public sentiment that she had acted under John's control. John's execution was stayed for 3 months while officials waited for the Privy Council's decision. On July 21, 1893, their final appeal was dismissed, and John's fate was sealed. He made one last desperate attempt to save himself, writing directly to the Premier of New South Wales, arguing that the evidence against him was weak and begging for his sentence to be reduced to life imprisonment like his wife's. The government refused, and on August 11th, the Executive Council made its final ruling. John's execution would proceed as planned. Just after 9 o'clock in the morning on August 15, 1893, John Makin stepped onto the gallows flanked by guards, his face impassive and his posture rigid as always. Even in his final moments, he showed no fear, no remorse, no acknowledgement of the 15 innocent lives he had taken. Few were permitted to witness the execution, and by all accounts, John met his fate with the same cold indifference that had defined him throughout his murderous career. He had spent his final days largely alone, though his family visited one last time. He left behind 2 written statements, one continuing to deny his guilt, claiming he had been wrongly convicted, and another addressed to his children, written in affectionate, almost fatherly terms. It was a final contradiction for a man who had shown no affection whatsoever to the infants under his supposed care. But while John's story ended with the drop of the gallows trapdoor, Sarah's punishment was just beginning. She had escaped death, but faced the slow, grinding punishment of life behind bars. Inside prison, she was treated with the same contempt as any cold-blooded killer, described in records as a quiet, unassuming inmate who kept to herself but carried an air of resentment that never quite faded. Over time, she was assigned work within the prison, and by 1898 she had become a hospital attendant, a bitter irony for someone who had systematically murdered infants. Despite her relative compliance, her health began to deteriorate during her incarceration. She suffered from intestinal hemorrhages that worsened over the years, leaving her increasingly weak and frail. In 1907, her daughters began petitioning for her early release, citing her declining health, but the request was denied. Sarah remained behind bars, a forgotten relic of one of Australia's most horrific crimes. When a new government took power, her daughters tried again in 1911, pleading that their mother be allowed to spend her final days with family. This time, their petition was quietly granted. On April 29, 1911, Sarah was discharged anonymously into the care of her daughter Florence. She lived for 7 more years in relative obscurity, her health continuing its steady decline. On September 13, 1918, Sarah Makin died at the age of 72, the official cause listed as senile decay and heart failure. Although she had lived for 25 years after her husband's execution, Sarah never truly escaped the shadow of her crimes. To the world, she remained Mother Makin, the woman who had helped bury innocent children one shallow grave at a time, turning motherhood itself into an instrument of murder for profit. The Makin case changed Australia forever, exposing the dark underbelly of unregulated adoption and leading to reforms that would protect vulnerable children and desperate mothers. But for the 15 babies whose lives were cut short in the name of profit, justice came too late. Their unmarked graves serve as a reminder that sometimes the most monstrous evil comes disguised as kindness, and that the most vulnerable among us depend on our vigilance to protect them from those who would prey upon innocence itself. Standing here today on Byron Street, where this horror was first uncovered, I can't help but think about how many other secrets might be buried beneath our feet, waiting for someone brave enough to dig deeper and uncover the truth. If you've made it this far, you know that evil doesn't always announce itself with fanfare. Sometimes it comes with a gentle voice, a kind smile, and promises of a better future that will never come.